There's something haunting and beautiful about places which were once full of life, but now stand empty. When we look upon them, we can get an impression of what they used to be. Abandoned sites are like living museums, testaments to what once was. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at some of the most stunning abandoned locations in the world. The crumbling facade of the Cherokee power plant in South Carolina, USA, is a monument to a failed vision. Construction work at the plant began in the 1970s, when Duke Power decided that a powerful 3-reactor nuclear power station was precisely what the area needed in order to deal with its increasing energy needs. The dream was destined never to become a reality. Economic problems halted work at the site during the 1980s, and it fell into abandonment. The only production work that's ever happened here was on a movie. The location was used by James Cameron when he was filming The Abyss in 1987. Unlike many of the sites you'll see in this video, though, the Cherokee power plant might have a future. There's still demand for a new power facility in the area, and an application was filed to tear down the incomplete buildings and build a new power station here in 2008. The request was granted, but the work is yet to begin. You don't get a name like Belle Isle without being beautiful, and the natural beauty of this part of Detroit is probably the reason why a children's zoo was built there. The Belle Isle Zoo opened in 1895, changing its name to the Detroit Children's Zoo in 1947. By the 1980s, it was Safariland and had an African wildlife theme that was popular with adults and children alike. As the 20th century drew toward a close, poor management and economic issues saw its fortunes begin to fade. Once upon a time, there were monkeys, bears, deer, and snakes roaming this land, but they've long since been evacuated. The zoo closed for winter in late 2001 and simply failed to reopen in 2002. By 2004, local residents were campaigning to have their zoo reopened. They thought they'd succeeded when a bond was granted, but Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick decided to use the money to pay a construction company to build a new zoo at the other end of Detroit instead. Interestingly, the mayor had close personal ties with the company who built the new zoo. Opening a theme park in Orlando, Florida is always asking for trouble. You have Disney for neighbors, and Disney's parks are always bound to draw more dollars than any independent operator. Perhaps the real surprise about the abandoned Skull Kingdom is that it managed to survive in Disney's shadow for so long. The foreboding skull-fronted castle was once an iconic sight on International Drive, offering spooky thrills to anybody who dared to walk through it after it opened in 1993. By 1999, it was expanding, picking up both visitors and attractions from the closure of another haunted theme park called Terror. Every night at Skull Kingdom there was a magic show, which persuaded people to stay a little later and spend a little more. A few years later, though, visitor numbers were dropping, and there just wasn't enough money to carry out badly needed renovation work. If you'll pardon the expression, Skull Kingdom gave up the ghost in 2006. Anybody sailing to or from Cavite City in the Philippines will have seen what looks like an ancient concrete battleship marooned in the water, with its rusting guns still trained on the horizon. It's not really an old battleship, but it isn't far off. This is Fort Drum, also known as El Fraile Island, and was once a busy and highly valued military outpost. Fort Drum was tasked with defending Manila Bay after the Spanish-American War ended. The artificial island was created by leveling out a craggy rock and then loading it with reinforced concrete in the shape of a mighty ship. Originally, there were also wooden barracks, but these were removed when it was found that they limited the swivel potential of the guns. To an enemy vessel in the distance, it would look like a fearsome battle boat. The Japanese briefly captured Fort Drum during the Second World War, but were beaten back off it in 1945. Retaking it came at a cost, though. The entire fort was set on fire using masses of gasoline. The Japanese had to retreat, but the sea base was damaged beyond use. It's been standing as a burned-out shell ever since. Small submarines can sometimes pose a more significant threat than large ones. They're quick, agile, difficult to identify and hard to attack. The Japanese made extensive use of them during the Second World War, including in the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. Toward the end of the war, a whole new generation of midget submarines, known as the Koryu class, had been assembled in Kure and were ready for action. They never saw any action, though, because Japan surrendered before they could be deployed. That left a whole fleet of them rotting in dry dock ever since. These Koryu-class crafts were intended to be Japan's final line of defense if American warships closed in on Japanese harbors. By the standards of midget submarines, they're quite large. They're 86 feet long, weigh 60 tons, and have space for a crew of 5. Each submarine would carry 2 deadly 17.7-inch torpedoes, more than capable of doing severe damage to an enemy vessel. 115 of the craft had been completed by the time of the surrender. Over 500 more were in various stages of being built. Many buildings constructed during times of war find no purpose in times of peace. Poland found itself right at the heart of the Second World War, and it has the concrete scars to show for it. One of them is Torpedo Dia, which is 1,000 feet off the coast of Gdynia. Built by the occupying German army, this was once a fearsome torpedo launch station. The Germans owned and used it from 1942 through 1945, but were then forced to surrender it after they lost the war. Poland briefly took over operations of the station, but then handed it over to the USSR. The Soviets used it as a training station rather than an active armament, and abandoned it after it fell into disrepair. As they left, they deliberately blew up the wooden pier that connected the facility to the land, ensuring that unwelcome visitors would have a hard time gaining access. Large chunks of it have since fallen into the sea, but some brave swimmers sometimes still head out to it to take a closer look. Various foreign nations have built military facilities in the baking hot lands of Cambodia, but none of them look quite as palatial as Bokor Hill Station in the Kampot province, which stands in the jungles of the country's south. The impressive-looking building was actually a leisure retreat for French soldiers. The humid, oppressive conditions in that region had been known to claim the lives of French soldiers without a shot being fired, and so Bokor Hill Station was intended to provide shelter and respite. Completed in the 1920s, Bokor Hill wasn't so much a building as a miniature town. It had a post office, a church for soldiers to worship in, and even a grand hotel and casino. It's the hotel and casino structure that's still standing today, although it's in rough shape. The French fled Cambodia during the Civil War in the 1940s, and the brutal Khmer Rouge movement took ownership of it a few years later. The area around the station was battered by fighting in the decades that followed. Even the 3,500-foot-long road to the old hotel is puckered and broken. There is no mistaking the intricate entrance of Fort Santiago. Even in its semi-ruined state, you can tell this was once a place of great importance. Hidden away inside the walls of the city Intramuros in the Philippines, this is Fort Santiago. It's the oldest of all of the Spanish fortresses in the islands. The first settlement here was built by Muslims in 1571, but the Spanish ransacked and destroyed the town, building the fort in its place and using it as a stronghold during the years of the spice trade. Even the Spanish couldn't hold on to it forever. It became a U.S. Army HQ during the colonial era, and then a prison after the Japanese captured it during the Second World War. Thousands of prisoners, both American and Filipino, were held and subjected to brutal treatment during the final years of the war. The Japanese lost Fort Santiago during the Battle of Manila in 1945, but much of the fort was destroyed in the process. It's now a national park with the ruins preserved for visitors to inspect during guided tours. A few vast, rutting ditches in a field in Lincolnshire, England, are all that remains of what was once the most advanced radar facility in the world. This grassy site was once the Stenengat facility of the British Royal Air Force and home of the country's most crucial radar station during the Second World War. As part of the Chain Home Radar Network, Stenengat was part of the world's first practical radar system and also the first integrated air defense system in the world. These dishes are correctly called tropospheric scatter dishes, capable of both sending and receiving microwave radio. As such, they could pinpoint and identify enemy aircraft at a long range. NATO took over operations at the site when the war ended, using it as a long-term communications hub which handled transmissions in 9 NATO-allied countries. By the late 1980s, it was showing its age and was deemed obsolete as the decade came to an end. Demolition work followed during the early 1990s, leaving only these 4 dishes still standing, along with the shell of the old radar tower. Eerie old buildings don't come more Gothic-looking than Hafendunos Hall in Llangornu, Wales. It would be hard to imagine a vampire calling this place home. The current mansion that stands at the site was built in 1861, replacing an older mansion that had stood since 1674. The true origins of the habitation here are even older and more mysterious. It's known that homes here stood as early as 1530, but nobody knows who built them or what happened to them. The Sandbach family, who paid for the mansion to be built in the 1860s, retained ownership of it and lived within it until the 1930s. After that, it became an exclusive private school for girls, but doubled up as a safe house for evacuees during the Second World War. It then became a college, and after that, a residential care home. That takes us through to 1993, when dry rot was starting to chew through the structure, and it had to be abandoned. An arson attack in 2004 did terrible damage to the bulk of the mansion, including the former main bedrooms and parlors. Despite that, a private owner bought what's left of Hafendunos in 2010 and is slowly undertaking restoration and repair work with the intention of one day living inside it. The great American fascination with dinosaurs didn't begin with the first Jurassic Park movie in the 1990s. The existence of Prehistoric Forest attraction proves there was an audience for attractions featuring the giant lizards long before that. It was opened way back in 1963. At its peak, this was a stunning attraction. The massive fiberglass dinosaurs were just a sideshow. There was an artificial volcano, a safari train, and a gigantic water slide, which boasted a 400-foot drop into the water. It might still be entertaining visitors to this day if it were not for the creation of new interstate roads. Suddenly, there just weren't as many people driving past this part of Onstead, Michigan as there used to be. Numbers dropped away rapidly during the 1980s, and the doors were finally closed for the last time in 2002. Since then, what's left here is falling apart. Some of the dinosaur statues have been stolen or vandalized, and the old waterfall is so severely dilapidated it may need to be demolished. During its heyday, the Orpheum Theatre in New Bedford staged incredible vaudeville shows. By the end of its period of usefulness, the only occupants were huge piles of tobacco. Perhaps the original owners should have known any business that traded here would be doomed to failure. It opened on the same day the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank in April 1912. For 4 decades, it was owned by the French Sharpshooters Club and operated as an opera house. The shows came to an end during the Second World War when the Army requisitioned it for use as a training base, but then reopened as a cinema during the 1950s after the military moved out. It didn't catch on as a cinema, and reintroducing vaudeville shows didn't generate enough money to keep it open either. By 1958, it had been sold to a tobacco company who did nothing with it other than store their tobacco there before shipment. Now, they too are gone, and the building remains standing, waiting to entertain the public once more. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.